Welcome, everybody. I'm just seeing the numbers come up at the bottom of my screen. So we're up to 26, so there's a few more to come. All right, we're into the 30s, we're moving up. It's a bit like UK inflation, this, isn't it? If we say it long enough. Hopefully it won't be in the 30s per se, but the rate of increase. Well, it seems to have slowed down. So I think we'll actually start to run our event. So as I said, welcome. Kitty and I are going to go through the kind of economic forecast for the UK for 2022. And interestingly, both of us had a session with the Bank of England at the end of November. And the forecasts we discussed then are somewhat different to the forecasts we're going to be discussing today. And we were just kind of joking, perhaps we should be doing this on a regular basis because the kind of rate of change effectively from the kind of the Bank of England and also the kind of key economic indicators are really quite dramatic. So next slide, and we'll start the kind of presentation proper. So just introduce myself. I'm John McLean. I've been the City of London chair now for nearly a year. I joined the IoD in 1991, so I have been a kind of a long-serving member, and indeed I have used the IoD significantly, both in terms of location, but probably more importantly for kind of my training and upgrading my skills. So it has been part of my life for the last 30 years. I'd just like to hand over to my fellow panelist, Kitty.
Thanks very much, John. Good evening, everyone. It's absolutely great to be here. So I'm the Chief Economist at the Institute of Directors. So shall I move into my presentation now?
No, not quite. No. I'm just going to go through the kind of the benefits of the IoD. So just to kind of give you an overview of our plan for tonight, which is fundamentally all about the presentation from Kitty. And I'll just go through an element about our policy and what we're focusing on this year, and then we'll have plenty of time for any questions, and then we'll move into a networking at the end. So we'll start to move on to the next one, IoD membership. Right. To become a member of the IoD, I think will be, as I've just demonstrated at the start, a theme that will actually help you in business for all of your life. And the benefits of membership go from business resources and research. I mean, that's very handy. If you want to find information about a particular company in detail, that we have a library and librarians, effectively intelligence officers, who can actually pick up this information and help everybody. Legal and tax helpline. In a very kind of complex world, that's incredibly helpful because you can actually ask those difficult questions and not pay a fortune because that is all part of your membership. Using the lounges wherever you may be, whether it be for London at 116 or in the city at Tower Bridge. Professional development, as I kind of indicated at the start, kind of keeping up to date with rules and regulation is incredibly difficult, and to be able to kind of get your skills upgraded, because if you think of where we are post-COVID in terms of the kind of emotional quotient for leadership, we've all got to change our spots, so this helps us. Training and qualifications, you can become a chartered director, you can get certificates, you can actually improve yourself and demonstrate to others that you are actually on the road and you believe in kind of true governance. Influence in government, I'll mention this slightly later on in terms of kind of our policy research and our kind of policy advocacy on your behalf. This is going to be, I think, a very important part for 2022. And of course, events, networking, and special interest groups. You know, we want to bring people together. And indeed, for this particular event, we had planned to have a kind of a real live version at 116, but of course, life changed. But the intention is to have a real life event later in March, is what we're thinking currently. Anyway, so enough of that. And now I'd like to hand over to Kitty to go through her presentation. Over to you, Kitty.
Thank you very much, John, and apologies for jumping the gun there. So keen am I to do my presentation, and thank you very much for that introduction. So I'm taking as a sort of exam question for what is to come, are we all set to power ahead, or will the economic headwinds nip our recovery in the bud? To truly mix metaphors there, because there's a lot to be very optimistic about, actually, in terms of the UK economy looking ahead to 2022. But there are some sort of very obvious sort of risks and problems ahead as well. And that seemed like as good a sort of framework for introductions as anything else. So I'm dividing my remarks into reasons to think we're powering ahead, and then some headwinds that we need to understand so that we can work with them and manage that risk. And then finally, some key questions that I'm asking our members and indeed other entrepreneurs, and in particular sort of growing small and medium-sized businesses, as I go about my job, to try and sort of fully understand how the lived experience of business leaders is fitting the data that we're looking at on a national basis as well. I'm going to draw on Office of National Statistics data in particular, but also our own internal market research of our members. So for those who don't know, we have around 20,000 members across the UK, mainly, a few abroad as well, but mainly in the UK. And we survey them through a sort of pulse survey every month called Policy Voice. So if you are an IoD member, do get on the panel for that, because we use that data extensively, both to provide insight, but also in our routine conversations with government, who are very keen to know what the business environment feels like for obvious reasons. So, reasons to be cheerful, first of all, reasons to think that we're powering ahead. Here's the kind of headline graph of what's been going on in the British economy since just before the financial crisis. I've run it all the way back to January 2007. This is GDP, not the growth in GDP, but the actual sort of amount of prosperity that our economy has generated on a monthly basis. So you can see straight away the very classic U-shaped recession, and what felt at the time, indeed it was, a very slow recovery following the financial crisis. Started to look bad in Q3 2007, and didn't really get back to where we were there until sort of the middle towards the end of 2012. And then the economy growing at its pretty much long run trend rate. And then obviously the extraordinary shutting down of around a third of the economy almost overnight as the pandemic hit. Bounced back pretty quickly, and then a bit of a sort of hiatus as lockdowns 2 and 3 this time last year came into force, but not as an extreme an effect as we had originally seen. And then quite a good bounce back as restrictions eased. And then where we are now is pretty much back where we started. So the answer to kind of question number one, how long will it take to get back to where we started, is the latest data, which came out just last week, showed that was achieved by November at the end of last year, and that's the most recent data. So looking forward, That's the dotted line. Pretty optimistic actually for 2022. The official forecast from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which was published in October, is for 6% growth in 2022. That was before Omicron hit, which has had a bit of a sort of shakeout in terms of confidence, and obviously some sectors quite badly affected. We can come to that later on. So I think maybe 6 is on the kind of high side. I think a lot of forecasters predicting between 4 and 5, possibly 3.5. I would say at least 3.5% growth. Now, bear in mind that our sort of normal run rate is around 2%. That's a pretty optimistic prospect. So if you're a business leader, I would say kind of point 1 is, subject to all the risks that we're about to discuss, is presume and prepare for pretty strong growth in the macro economy for 2022. Now, that depends on a lot of crucial assumptions, and what is really happening behind the scenes here is, in order for that growth to take place, is a big readjustment, because you can think of economic growth, GDP, as the aggregate, the sort of sum of all the demand in the economy. Anyone who's done GCSE economics, I'm sure, will be able to recite the relevant equation, but you've got, it's the sum of everything that's being bought. Now, of course, what's happened in the last year is that a lot of that buying stuff has taken place by government, because we've seen massive state intervention in the economy, paying people's wages, huge increase in NHS spending, big outflows to local government to support local businesses, and the self-employed schemes, and also obviously reductions in business rates and everything that was done as part of the pandemic response. Now that's being phased back now. And so in order for the economy to keep growing, we need the private sector to start spending much more, and indeed more than the government was, in order to keep that level of growth. And then at the same time, you've got problems at our borders, problems, perhaps a big word. You've got dislocations, you've got frictions as we leave the EU. So that might reduce exports a little as people readjust, and our European trading partners think it might be a bit of frankly, a faff to be trading with Britain. So maybe the growth's not coming from there, maybe that's more stable. In which case it needs to be households and it needs to be businesses that are spending the money to keep these growth rates. So there are some pretty optimistic assumptions in both the official and private sector sort of banking forecasts about where this GDP growth is coming from. It presumes that consumers want to go out and spend, which I think is probably realistic. But if the cost of living issue becomes so forefront of our minds that we decide it would be more sensible to retrench, then that optimism will prove a little unfounded. And if businesses decide that actually the world is too uncertain and they're not going to invest for the future, then that will also mean that this growth forecast is beginning to look a bit optimistic. So I want to, in the rest of my remarks, perhaps talk a little bit, keep referring back to those potential sort of downside scenarios. And it's probably worth saying that the official forecast expects business investment across the economy as a whole to be 16% higher than it was last year in 2021. Now that's a big jump. So what we have to sort of always think in the back of our minds is that what my business is doing? Is that what your business is doing? Is that what the climate is supporting at the moment? Because if it isn't, this growth forecast is looking pretty optimistic. But based on the information that we have, that's where we are. So top line is recovery and growing back beyond, fairly rapidly, back beyond where we were before the pandemic hit. So far, so good. Turning to the labour market, this is the unemployment rate. So that's the percentage of people looking for work who can't find it. And you'll see immediately, again, I've run it back to early 2007, that the unemployment effect from the pandemic is really quite modest compared to the unpleasant situation faced by many workers during the financial crisis. So although unemployment rose noticeably as the pandemic hit, a lot of people let their staff go despite the furlough scheme. It peaked in the middle of 2020 and has been falling ever since. In fact, it's been outperforming. And if you look at the grey line, that was where the Office of Budget Responsibility thought those out of work would go once the furlough scheme ended. As you can see, they thought it would rise a little, but in fact, that's been proved completely wrong, and it's continued a downward march. Now, if there hadn't been a furlough scheme, I would have expected unemployment to rise probably at least as much as it had during the financial crisis, because that's what happened in the US, where they didn't have a furlough scheme. A really sharp spike and then came back down again as measures were taken to boost demand in the economy. In the US, it was done by sending everyone checks because they panicked, basically. But what I really want you to understand is that by the time the furlough scheme had ended at the end of September, pretty much anyone who was on furlough had either shifted, sadly, into inactivity or was already employed, even if it wasn't for the same employer, such that they weren't available. And that's one of the reasons why we've had sort of skills shortages that have caused a problem, because there wasn't this sort of lump of people desperately looking for work. When the furlough scheme ended, they'd already been reabsorbed and they'd already made that decision about what they were going to do. So good news. For the economy, unemployment is not hugely high. Good news for demand and households, people are in work. Not so good if you're looking for staff, because there isn't a large pool of labour out there. And in fact, vacancies are incredibly high. This rather crowded graph is an attempt to describe what is happening in different sectors of the labour market. It takes what's called real-time data from the private sector, from Adzuna, who are the online jobs vacancy board, and they've rather brilliantly actually started to make their data available just a few weeks after it's kind of live. And they have rebased by sector back to before the pandemic. So every single part of the labour market here is indexed back so that February 2020 has a value of 100. And then you can see how everything has changed. So you see that vacancies fell as the pandemic hit. And then, of course, your eye is drawn to that top line, which is what's happening in the transport, logistics and warehousing sector. So it's problems well documented amongst HGV drivers, but it's also quite simply the amount of vacancies that have been created in the economy from everyone shifting to a greater proportion of their shopping being done online, which requires delivery services. So my hypothesis is that lots of people who are made furloughed, who are furloughed from leisure and hospitality, shifted into the kind of courier market where there was massive demand, and they could carry on receiving furlough payments with one hand whilst working in where there was greater demand with the other hand, so to speak, and that was perfectly legitimate, but that then explains why unemployment didn't rise when the furlough scheme ended. Now, the big black line is the whole economy. So vacancies started to increase to a higher level than they were pre-pandemic, April 2021. And you can see it's now beginning to start to steady. This data goes into the second week of January. Now, I suspect this is just kind of quite good news in a way. Maybe it shows that labour shortages are easing, although I haven't heard that anecdotally, or it could be the beginning of an economic sort of reduction in demand. I haven't seen that in any other data, but I guess that's another possibility. Or it could be a sort of natural supply and demand as wage rates are beginning to rise. Firms are beginning to sort of take on less people. But the overall story is still very high vacancies, but distributed across different sectors. So Turning now to some, this is still reasons to be cheerful, believe it or not, turning to some of our own internal data. We ask a tracker question to our members about how optimistic they are about their firm, their organization's own prospects for the future. So this is the company that they know very, very well. How optimistic, very optimistic, quite optimistic, not at all. So neither, quite pessimistic, very pessimistic. And this is the net answer. And you'll see that it returned to the long run trend probably second quarter of last year, of people feeling pretty optimistic about their organization's future. It's a bit volatile, but then it quite often is, could be a sample size issue there. A bit of a wobble perhaps in September, and the last data point is going downwards, but only very slight. So I would say that, you know, the world has changed, but in terms of the amount of control that people feel over their own organization, that seems to now have returned to trend, which is good news. In terms of investment intentions, which, as I previously said, are absolutely crucial for the economy, and as a sort of take a kind of snapshot of how people are feeling about the future, that has also come back and is really not looking bad at all compared to the 5 years before the pandemic. But remember that the 5 years before the pandemic were also not a time of great uncertainty, because it's the 5 years from the it was a bit less than 5 years actually, isn't it? From the referendum, and then all the stuff about will we have a deal or not have a deal, and log jams in Parliament, a number of different general elections, a feeling of instability that was meaning that a lot of firms held off on their investment plans because the future looked so uncertain. And then once that was resolved with a clear parliamentary majority at the end of 2019, the world looked rosy for a moment until the pandemic hit. So I think this is a pretty good story. I would say investment intentions in summer last year were looking very rosy. Since then, with the emergence of the economic headwinds on the supply side that I'll come to shortly, investment intentions began to go down a little, but they're still broadly positive. And then the last data point is for December. So you can see that the sort of mood that changed slightly because of Omicron, which made it point downwards a little, but not huge in the great scheme of things. So not too bad, reason still to be cheerful. And this is reflected in a one-off question we asked in October. We wanted to gauge the sense of ambition amongst small and medium-sized companies in Britain, and we asked people how ambitious their organisation was feeling at the moment. I really like this result because it shows you know, how resilient and positive business leaders tend to be, entrepreneurs tend to be, they're problem solvers. It's a pleasure to work with you. And you'll see the vast majority have plans for steady growth, and a very a minority, but a significant minority, are saying we have ambitious plans to scale up fast. Similar proportion happy to remain stable at the current level of business, or perhaps not investing. But all of those are much more sort of significant than those respondents who seem to be experiencing difficulties. I phrase that as consolidating activity, focusing on our core offering, cutting costs in a difficult trading environment. You can see each of those are themselves probably only sum to just over 10%. So this is October, but I would summarise as you know, the engine of growth in Britain is planning to grow. So that's all great news. Okay, that's the positive bit. Headwinds. Well, we track this through another question about confidence, but instead of asking people about confidence in their organisation, we ask them about how optimistic they are about the wider UK economy. And we ask them every month, and this gets published on the first of the month for the preceding month, if you see what I mean. So we publish this over New Year for December, and it shows the net proportion of our members who are feeling optimistic about the future of the UK economy over the following year. So if it's negative, we've got more people feeling pessimistic than optimistic. And here you see the story very clearly. There was a sort of moment of euphoria when the general election appeared to get rid of the uncertainty that were in the leadership of our country, and then a total collapse in March, April 2020, as you would expect. And then as we came out of what felt at the time, happy days, as the final restrictions in the early summer, we recorded an all-time high in terms of confidence about the economy. And in my mind, that's kind of where we kind of want to be. And that's sort of where the economy is trying to end up. This is, I've said a few times in interviews in the last few weeks, that this is fundamentally, thankfully, an economy that wants to grow. And we just sort of sometimes feel that there are things getting in our way, but we want to go out there and power ahead and be future focused. And that's what was coming out in the data in June and July. And then in September, with the energy price rises and the announcement, very surprise announcement about national insurance rises, and the realization that there was problems in the international shipping market that hadn't been fully thought through, that started to come down. And then it took a noticeable tumble in December as well. So at the end of last year, there were more small business leaders, small and medium-sized business leaders feeling pessimistic about the economy over the next 12 months than were feeling optimistic. Now, my sense is that in the couple of weeks since this last data point is that that's improving. So I would expect that to rise in January, but it's going to be very interesting to see. Now, why does this matter? In a sense, business confidence is just the result of a poll where we ask people who happen to be business leaders, but they're also just members of the public, reading the news, smelling the air, having their own household budgets to manage. And if you looked at consumer confidence trackers, you'd find quite a similar picture actually to the picture I just showed you. But of course, when it's business leaders, then it affects investment decisions. And so then it starts to matter in terms of the future growth of the economy as well. And we asked a question of those business leaders who's told us they weren't planning to increase investment in the next year. We asked them whether there's anything we could do to get them to change their mind. So the question was, as is on the screen, you said that you planned to keep the level of investment the same or reduce it in the next 12 months. We just asked people who told us that. Would any of the following cause you to decide to increase investment instead? Now, the following was a complete kind of dream wish list of anything we could think about, anything we could think of that had ever been in the policy debate that might cause you to increase investment. We had tax breaks on there, we had grants, we had all sorts of policy issues that people have been telling us about for ages. And we also put on there something about the macroeconomy. Now, we got a lot of different answers, but the top one I think is really interesting because out of everything that we suggested, the winner, and it was a winner by a clear margin, was stronger growth prospects for the UK economy. So we've got this catch-22 situation going on here where the economy needs investment to go up in order to grow, but investment is being held back by the perception of what's going on in the wider macroeconomy. And that's why our confidence indicator of what business leaders think about the macroeconomy is really important. Because if people think we're going, frankly, to hell in a handcart, then they're far less likely to put their own retained profits, their slush fund, their shareholders' money, oh, I've just lost myself for a moment, into their business because they think there's or get into more debt to go into their business, take on debt to invest in their business if they think that the fundamental business climate is uncertain. You can laugh at me now because I'm sitting in the office, and because I've been sitting still talking at you for too long, the light's gone off. I'm just going to carry on like this till the end of my presentation. I think you can see me okay. So, what is it that's making people feel a little uncomfortable? The inflation is the key one. So John mentioned this in the introduction to this seminar, and there is no doubt that the Bank of England is surprised by the speed with which prices are accelerating. Now, we picked this up in the autumn, and in our last seminar, that IoD London ran at the end of November, I remember saying to the Bank of England agent that we think interest rates need to rise because inflation is becoming endemic. That has now kind of proved to be the case. This is my finger in the air forecast. I'd be interested to know what people think. but it's currently running at CPI inflation is running at 5.4%. We know that there's going to be more energy price rises in April and with the national insurance rise as well. And with what people are telling us about their ability to pass on higher costs in many sectors to higher prices, I'm going for 7. I'm going for 7 and then falling back perhaps a little more slowly than on the graph. The US rate is currently running at 7. So what this means, and this is higher than the sort of official forecasts, what this means is that the Bank of England is going to meet in early February. There's nothing else they can do except raise interest rates to try and change expectations. But obviously they'll be very concerned that if they do so very abruptly, that might choke off consumer demand and cause other problems in the sort of medium term. But there is no doubt that this is accelerating and away from their target. So that's a very big takeaway I want you to fully internalize in your planning, and I'd be interested in comments there. Another headwind for businesses in particular is how is the government going to pay for the fact that they have massively increased spending. Here's the last 100 years of government debt as a proportion of GDP, which is the most meaningful way of looking at it. And you'll see we now have the highest stock of debt, that's what this graph shows, in peacetime, but that we have come down from higher stocks of debt in the past, most notably in the 1950s and 1960s. You'll see that the increase in debt due to the financial crisis was pretty steep actually, and the pandemic is noticeable, but not quite as much. But you'll also see, and this is the main point, that the forecast is that it will peak shortly and then start to fall. And why will it start to fall? Well, we know that because the main decisions have been made as to how to pay for the pandemic. And that is primarily through corporation tax rises that will come into effect in just over a year's time. So April 2023, the main rate of corporation tax will go from 19 to 25%. That was decided over a year ago. It was quite an interesting way of doing it, actually, because by pre-announcing a big hit to a big sort of take from private sector profits, they didn't take money away from business immediately, but they told the financial markets that they had a plan. And so that sort of calmed things down a bit. Whether they'll be able to get it through Parliament, if Parliament's feeling tetchy at the time later on, will be tricky, or whether there's calls to reverse it. Since then, we've also had the rise in national insurance that kind of got bounce through. I suspect that will lead to more disquiet than the corporation tax rise, since the corporation tax, although no one likes tax, was sort of low by international standards beforehand. So I guess I mentioned this because it's a headwind, because it's annoying if you're an entrepreneur and you've got to give more of your profits away, but it is also, on the plus side, a lot of people sort of feel quite anxious that there's going to be a massive tax rise they don't know about because of the scale of government spending. But I sort of reassure you that that decision has already been made, and there's no particular reason to think there'll be something else enormous. Famous last words. More when we ask our businesses what they're worrying about, what's having a negative effect on their organisation. Obviously, we get coronavirus, the macro stuff I'm talking about. The first substantive issue is skills shortages. Then we get trade, a large proportion of our members trade, and the whole sort of increased complexity there is making life very difficult. Then we get the sort of traditional business issues around tax and regulation, then infrastructure, then financial market issues very low down. So this is how people are feeling kind of in general. The tax and regulation, although no one likes them, were kind of third in the list, but within that, concerns about employment taxation are rising, and within the broad infrastructure category, obviously concerns about energy prices are rising as well. Final substantive slide here. I just thought that this might be interesting. So we asked a qualitative question. So we didn't ask people to tick boxes. We asked them to just answer in their own words about what they wanted from government. So you can read the text at the top there, but in summary, we sort of said, in your own words, how can policy help you? Is there anything you want government to do or not do? And you can write as much or as little as you want. Big error, because it took ages to analyse it. But we did, we categorised it, and there's a lot of diversity of views, but we tried to categorise the answers. And we got all the things that we'd expected, in a sense. We got skills shortages, issues around EU and international trade. We got lower taxes, tax reform. We got regulatory stuff. We got a lot of views on flexible working, both for and against. Traditional stuff on IR35, sort of quantifiable but low. And then we got two things we weren't quite expecting. One was just simply about leadership. Business communities saying to government, you're in charge, give us a plan, a visible plan for developing business. And the other thing we got that we weren't expecting was action, please, leadership, please, on net zero. Now, this was done in October, so COP26 was going on at the time, and we'd also asked some other questions in the same survey. But take those two together, and I think government sometimes doesn't realise the scope that it has to set the framework, to set the agenda, to tell businesses what it is that they should be doing, and that's kind of what our members want. So finally, and very quickly, because I know we'll come to this later, what I'm interested in knowing and what I'm asking firms at the moment is, are you investing for growth in 2022? To the extent that you're experiencing higher costs, both in terms of supply chain difficulties and also in terms of needing to pay more to attract staff, given that there are skills shortages, are you able to pass those through to your own customers? Or are you absorbing them, or are you doing something else, in which case, what are you doing? Because that question is crucial to understanding whether we are, in fact, in a sort of wage price inflationary spiral or not. And then looking to the medium term, are we going to get medium term growth? I'm interested in whether firms have actually, with hindsight, made efficiency improvements that are going to stand them in good stead in the future as a result of the pandemic. Classic example might be investing in cloud computing type software that actually does bring a business benefit, but you wouldn't have got around to doing it if you hadn't had to do it in the pandemic. And there's lots of other examples like that. But I shall draw it to a close now. John, I've prevailed upon your patience, and I'm sitting here in a darkened room and need to jump around and wave my arms.
Right.
But I hope that gives a framework as to what we're thinking about at the moment. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I'll hand it back to you now, John.
Brilliant. Many thanks indeed, Kitty. Thank you. As we've just gone through that, can I just kind of focus on, whilst I'm going to go through a few things for 5 minutes, if you've got any questions from what Kitty has said, please use the Q&A function. And specifically, she ended up with 3 priorities that she would like to hear from in terms of investing for growth, high costs passed on or absorbed, or have you put in any kind of efficiency improvements whilst we were going through the kind of COVID period? Those are kind of quite key in terms of determining the kind of economic analysis. So if you could think about that and address those in your questions, because then we can bring that up for later on. Right, policy priorities for 2022. So can I go to the next slide? Now, just Kitty mentioned policy voice. Policy voice is a kind of a key enabler for the IoD to get views from the members of what is important to them and what we as IoD can do for you as an advocate on your behalf. The IoD meets government every week and has a quite a good track record of performance. But specifically, just to kind of put this into perspective, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but IoD policy wins in 2021 were down here, 7 of them. So it does actually show that there is a benefit in getting information so that the advocates, when they sit in front of government, can actually say, we spoke to our members and our members said this, and they continually say this. There's not enough being done. So when we talk about a voice, the more we hear, the kind of greater the voice. We're not quite shouting, but we can actually have a kind of strengthened argument at the table. So taking into account the analysis that we've had this year. If I can have the next slide, please. Which kind of what can we do to improve the business operating environment? And I hope you like the kind of the colourful the slides here. But I think it's probably fair to say that it's not going to be a surprise, following on from what Kitty said for 2021. Improving relationships, EU, skill shortage, which everybody's crying out about, UK economic conditions. And then we've got probably kind of a general melee of items. Cost of energy, interestingly enough, and don't forget this was done at 12th to 29th of November, was fairly low down the list. I would assume, therefore, that when this is done again, that item will come very much to the fore, because that actually affects everybody. So moving on to the next slide, what are the business policy priorities? Well, if I can say that working backwards, national insurance increase in April. There's been a lot of kind of comment in the press about this, and indeed IoD have been very strong on this and will continue to be strong, because given all the other headwinds, we need to kind of take something out and give something back to business, and also kind of allow businesses to feel far more confident about the future. There are too many headwinds which are difficult to bring them all together and actually think we should be doing more investment now. It's a postponement. We can't afford that. Overcoming bureaucracy, I think that's throughout business. Skill shortage, we're all facing that, and we'll be specifically focusing on some areas. And rebuilding confidence in trade. And when you actually look at trade, if you think of where we were this time last year, we just completed Brexit, but with kind of having gone through a kind of a transition, we now need to look at the nitty-gritty as to what can actually be done to actually make life easier. And if you kind of think of, businesses trading in Europe, now they have to look after, was it something like 27 countries in terms of kind of the VAT regimes that they've got to fill in paperwork, or indeed in terms of kind of the kite marks that the EU has, but we want to have our own, so we're actually kind of creating more friction for ourselves, or indeed the ability to kind of travel and trade throughout Europe. These are all inhibitors, and they need to be smoothed out. So those are some of the areas that the policy team at IoD will be looking at. And also, IoD is not just about policy and advocacy for government, but it's also about good governance, and obviously with the ESG priorities and green from COP, that is going to be very much to the fore this year. And I think the key is actually how we all put this into practice without actually being an inhibitor or a drag on our businesses. Don't forget, this is not a sprint to get it all done tomorrow. This is a marathon, but we all need to be thinking about it. And of course, directors' code of conduct, anything we can do to improve governance actually improves UK PLC. So the two walk hand in hand. The next one, please. Oh, my last question. I thought I was doing one more slide, but never mind. That's good, because by virtue of just going through that, we've actually got now 11 questions in the Q&A box. So the first one, I'm just going to go through it by order appearing. So am I moving up right? Yeah. Friction with EU about regulations. Any thoughts on what might happen to UK exports to EU in 2022?
Yes, great. Thank you for so many really excellent questions. I'm going to try and answer them briefly so that we can get through them. Thank you for that.
Something's gone wrong with your sound, I think.
Looks all right on my end. Can you hear me?
Can somebody just give me a thumbs up if Kitty's voice is all right?
Someone suggested on mute. Is that better? Shall I keep talking? It sounds all right to me. Huge echo. Oh no. I don't know if someone.
Doesn't work.
There. Is that better? Any better?
No, it's still a bit noisy.
Can the host, can I get some advice as to whether I can leave and come back?
I think that would probably be the best bit.
Or I can do it all virtually.
Come back.
Right, I'll do that. I'll see you in one moment. Talk amongst yourselves.
Right. Okay. I think one of the questions is, how do we compare to other major economies? If you actually look at the G7, we are going to be, or we're forecast to be, the best performing country, which is good news. However, if you put that in context with us, I think it's about 6.9 we're talking about. If you look at us compared to China, they're going to be at about 8.1. So notwithstanding we're doing well, there are other countries who are doing better than us. Sorry, I've just asked, can you, how do you get on?
How does this sound? Is that any better?
Absolutely fine. Brilliant.
Great. I'm so sorry.
What, just switching off, something off. So shall we start again?
Yes.
So friction with the EU about regulations. Any thoughts on what might happen to UK exports to EU in 2022?
Thank you. And thank you, David, for that question, and to everyone for their questions. I'll try and answer briefly, I was trying to say. So this, I think they'll rise. I think they'll rise compared to 2021 because growth is rising in the EU as well. So there'll be greater demand because although it hasn't been much fun negotiating, navigating is the word, the sort of new frictions as a result of Brexit in terms of our exports to the EU. There aren't going to be any more major changes. I know the imports are going to have got more customs controls still to come in. The only thing that would make me think, yes, so grow, the only thing that would make me think that's not the case is if we start seeing increased evidence that customers in the EU have just needed a bit of time to reorientate their supply chains away from Britain, and maybe if there was a lag effect there, that might start coming through this year. So I think it would probably not shrink any further, but it'll be at a lower level than it was prior to Brexit.
Okay, thank you. So Matt asks, is unemployment influenced by people leaving the workforce and no longer seeking employment, or is it jobs driven?
Great question. So unemployment is actually pretty much back to where it was before the pandemic, which is, is a better situation than people were expecting. But of course, we still have all these vacancies and skills shortages. So how does that all work? Well, our workforce is a bit smaller, and our workforce, one of the sort of longer sort of lasting effects of the pandemic, sadly, I think will be a rise in economic inactivity. So this is people who are not available for work, but they're not showing up in the unemployment data either because they're excluding themselves from the workforce. They're not looking for work. And this seems to mainly be people aged 50 to 64. And very sadly, the most sort of typical reason is that they say they are too poorly to work. They are long-term sick. So whether that is long COVID or whether it is the sort of debilitating effect of having been out of work for some time, if that group of those of that group who are furloughed is simply not known. There needs to be more work done there. There is separately a smaller but noticeable group who say that they've decided not to work even though they're of working age, and they call it for other reasons. Now, there isn't an option about sort of lifestyle reasons, so I suspect if people just think, actually, you know what, I don't need to and I don't want to, then that will show up in the other category. And just very briefly, we've seen the opposite trend amongst people who say the reason they're not available for work is because they're looking after family or the home. So participation increased quite dramatically when the pandemic hit amongst that group. So I'm wondering whether there might be another long-term effect of the pandemic, that flexible and remote working has made work more accessible to some. Younger people decided to stay in education for longer, but that has now reversed. They're now kind of back in the jobs market. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. I think I answered Cherish's question about GDP. We now go on to Jagdish's question. While supply chain issues are where we are, should we be influencing towards a multi-shoring manufacturing to reduce reliance on one country and reduce long-term supply chain issues?
I mean, yes, if that's what your business needs. And we're seeing different firms taking, making different decisions in order to reduce the risk. There's onshoring, there's building up inventories, there's doing different types of deals with suppliers. I'm hearing a lot of sort of energy being put into the relationship with suppliers that previously didn't need to. There's reconfiguring of processes in order to need different components that are more available, and so on and so on. So I think probably the main one at the moment seems to be increased lead times, which is frustrating, particularly you've got fixed costs. So when you say shouldn't we, I would say, well, there's going to be more of that just because of the change in the business environment, but obviously it'll vary firm by firm depending what sector you're in.
Right, we've got about 3 minutes left. So on questions, so David's question: consumer confidence in 2022 and desire to spend. Let's just kind of focus on that because
I think that's a key question. So at the moment, cost of living is definitely rising, but those who saved money during the pandemic are still quite keen to go out and spend it. But you've put your finger on the key question. If that changes, then we are in a completely different world. And so we'll just have to see how the people's perception of increased household costs translates into their own spending. Very unfortunate issue is that those who didn't save during the pandemic are the ones who are going to be most badly affected. If you're living hand to mouth, then it's the increase in energy bills that's going to particularly be difficult for you. So I would expect if the government feels political pressure to intervene, that's how they'll do it.
Right. Shirish, what are your assumptions for the drop of inflation by the end of the year? No indicators I've seen make me think that.
Yes, that's a really good question. I think I'm presuming, well, there was another question on the chat about, what is the mechanism for inflation to come down? I'm going to give what might sound quite a soft answer, but I believe it to be true, which is that it's all about expectations of inflation. If everybody thinks that inflation is high, then inflation becomes high in a self-fulfilling way because they feel it's all right to raise prices and grant higher wage demands and so on. So there's a sort of psychological thing here that the Bank of England needs to do, and it's really, really hard to do. They need to take action in a way that's sufficiently surprising that people think, oh, okay, they're on it. This is not going to be forever. I don't think it'll be possible to do that this side of April because we know there are more price rises coming down the line. But we will need to be in the spring realizing that actually the Bank of England is doing its job. That's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, inflation is a rate of change. So prices could rise and then remain at the high level and inflation will go back down. So we don't need prices to fall for inflation to go down. We just need them to stop rising. So I think I presume in the forecasts that we have a vaguely competent central bank who will work out and calibrate sufficiently the level to which they need to intervene to bring expectations down. Could be wrong.
But that's an interesting point, because when we had our session in November, we were talking about we wanted the Bank of England to put interest rates up, and they kind of bottled it then. And therefore, there's an element of actually having to demonstrate to all that they're not going to bottle it going forward.
Yes, and they're not starting from a good place in that regard, that they got the unemployment forecast completely wrong. And so they waited too long, and so expectations went the wrong way.
Right, one more question before we wrap up, and then we can carry on during the networking. The National Security Investment Act came into force on the 4th of January. The Act gives the government powers to scrutinise and intervene in business transactions to protect the national security. Does IoD have a position on this? If not, would IoD monitor the impact on investments and business transactions?
That's a really good question. I don't think we have said anything publicly. I don't know the legislation in detail, but obviously I know why it's being introduced. I think national security kind of trumps the free functioning of a market, particularly when it comes to foreign direct investment. I would be very, very interested in monitoring the effect of it. And if it felt like it was too heavy-handed, we would certainly have no hesitation in advocating for the entrepreneurial community in that regard. Yes, that's my answer to your question. So maybe via John, if you do have that evidence, or if you're a member of the IoD, just submit it in the normal way. That would be really interesting.
And also, I would just pick up some of the kind of the words within the Act are kind of, you know, positive or kind of beneficial to the UK or detrimental to the UK, and rather in kind of legal words, it's the kind of parlance and the practice and how those are interpreted. Nobody really knows how it will be interpreted, or indeed, different political parties may look at things fundamentally different to the other party. So we're in for a kind of a new regime here. Right, so at this point, I'm going to conclude the questions, and we've still got quite a number to go. So I'm just going to wrap up the session, and then we're all going to move across to a networking, and we'll cover the outstanding questions then. So what I'm just going to focus on is how to make the most out of your IoD membership. Obviously, we run a series of events, and we've got a major property event coming up next week. And what I'm going to say is that after the end of this, we'll be emailing all of you with a kind of summary and slides from today, together with some kind of pointers. So don't worry about not making notes here. Also, we've got another finance session with the Bank of England in March, and which will, following on from what we said, that will be a very interesting one to actually see the lie of the land. That'll be a few days after the MPC meeting. And then on the 1st of April, we've got a supporting entrepreneurs in the City of London at Mansion House to kind of promote entrepreneurship within SMEs. So we've got quite a few things in our plan. Also, just to highlight what I said about what the IoD membership brings to you, the Digital Academy, accreditation and leadership development. I think if you kind of stand back and listen to what Kitty has said about you as a businessman and managing your business, leadership is what you as a manager have actually got to do to actually kind of create their vision and actually help those within your company and indeed with your other stakeholders to actually understand what you're going to do and how you've actually kind of demonstrated that you can overcome the pitfalls which are presented, because that's what this country needs, that's what companies need. So this is very much part and parcel of what we can offer. And also, I think I mentioned about the advisory service. Being a kind of a CEO, a director in a particular field, sometimes it's lonely, sometimes it's very difficult to get those questions answered. Or where do you go? You can pick up the phone, you can speak to somebody, you can send the email. So all of these are available if you are a member of the IoD. So it kind of brings being a company director together. Right, on that point, I think now is the time to thank you all for joining us for the panel discussions. And now we're going to move over to a networking session where we'll all be on screen and we can discuss or answer the remaining questions and anything else that you may wish to ask us. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye and see you later.